Hello, my witchy friends. It's Figbury ASMR, and today I have a witchy fairy tale to read for you all from this anthology of Victorian fairy tales. Victorian fairy tales. And the subtitle is The Revolt of the Fairies and Elves. And there's this beautiful illustration on the cover. And it has this lovely spine as well with very bold font. And while there are quite a few different tales in here, I'm always looking for the witchy ones to read to you. And there are a lot of witches in Victorian fairy tales. So it just makes sense that I would read you one from that era. And we'll just flip through to the table of contents. So there's quite a few, lots that you might recognize. Authors like Lewis Carroll, for example, or A Toy Princess by Mary de Morgan, Cinderella and the Glass Slipper. There's also The Reluctant Dragon, but the one that we're going to look at, I have marked. There's a preface here as well, but I have it marked with this little piece of paper. So let's just flip over there. We missed it. Okay. It's right here. So I have it marked with this little illustration of some cats, Victorian cats, and I love this cat. It's from 1902, and he's like carrying a little lantern, and he's wearing like a coat, and he has this very surprised facial expression. And then there's this one of one cat grooming the other cat as though they're at like a hair salon. So I figured this was kind of the perfect bookmark for this book. I'll just put it over here for now. So the story that I want to read to you is by George MacDonald, and this part of the book is falling apart, so we have to be a little bit careful with it. And it says here that George MacDonald, and there's this medieval style decorated letter. George MacDonald was raised in Scotland, a farming region rich in folklore that was to influence his later writings. MacDonald studied at Aberdeen University between 1842 and 1845. And after receiving a master's degree, he went to London, where he completed his studies at a theological seminary in 1851. So a little bit more here. It says that he was an indefatigable writer and brilliant orator. And he wrote numerous stories in the Victorian period, 51 volumes. And his most significant narratives, it says here, are undoubtedly his fairy tales, which were written for children and adults. He was one of the first British writers to experiment successfully with the traditional motifs and themes of well-known tales such as Sleeping Beauty and Rapunzel by mocking them and developing new ideas of sexuality and love. He rebelled against the strict Victorian code of Puritan upbringing by questioning traditional roles and creating young protagonists who share their dreams in pursuit of compassionate love and equal partnership. So the story that I chose is called The Day Boy and the Night Girl. And it begins with witches. There was once a witch who desired to know everything. But the wiser a witch is, the harder she knocks her head against the wall when she comes to it. Her name was Watho, and she had a wolf in her mind. She cared for nothing in itself, only for knowing it. She was not naturally cruel, but the wolf had made her cruel. She was tall and graceful, with a white skin, red hair, and black eyes, which had a red fire in them. She was straight and strong, but now and then would fall bent together, shudder, and sit for a moment with her head turned over her shoulder, as if the wolf had got out of her mind onto her back. And then there's another heading here, and it says, Aurora. This witch got two ladies to visit her. One of them belonged to the court, and her husband had been sent on a fat and difficult embassy. The other was a young widow whose husband had lately died, and who had since lost her sight. Watho lodged them in different parts of her castle, and they did not know of each other's existence. The castle stood on the side of a hill, gently sloping down into a narrow valley, in which was a river with a pebbly channel and a continual song. The garden went down to the bank of the river, enclosed by high walls, which crossed the river and there stopped. Each wall had a double row of battlements, and between the rows was a narrow walk. In the topmost story of the castle, the Lady Aurora occupied a spacious apartment of several large rooms looking southward. The windows projected oriel-wise over the garden below, and there was a splendid view from them both, up and down and across the river. The opposite side of the valley was steep, but not very high. Far away, snow peaks were visible. These rooms Aurora seldom left, but their airy spaces, the brilliant landscape and sky, the plentiful sunlight, the musical instruments, books, pictures, curiosities, with the company of Watho, made herself charming, precluded all dullness. She had venison and feathered game to eat, milk and pale, sunny, sparkling water to drink. She had hair of the yellow gold, waved and rippled. Her skin was fair, not white like Watho's, and her eyes were of the blue of the heavens when bluest. Her features were delicate but strong, her mouth large and finely curved and haunted with smiles. Behind the castle, the hill rose abruptly. This is under Vesper. The northeastern tower, indeed, was in contact with the rock and communicated with the interior of it. For in the rock was a series of chambers, known only to Watho and the one servant whom she trusted, called Falca. Some former owner had constructed these chambers after the tomb of an Egyptian king, and probably with the same design, for in the center of one of them stood what could only be a sarcophagus, but that and others were walled off. The side and roofs of them were carved in low relief and curiously painted. Here the witch lodged the blind lady, whose name was Vesper. Her eyes were black, with long black lashes. Her skin had a look of darkened silver, but was of purest tint and grain. Her hair was black and fine and straight flowing. Her features were exquisitely formed, and if less beautiful, yet more lovely from sadness, she always looked as if she wanted to lie down and not rise again. Me too. I relate to that. She did not know she was lodged in a tomb, though now and then she wondered she had never touched a window. There were many couches covered with richest silk, and soft as her own cheek for her to lie upon. And the carpets were so thick she might have cast herself down anywhere, as befitted a tomb. The place was dry and warm and cunningly pierced for air, so that it was always fresh and lacked only sunlight. There the witch fed her upon milk and wine dark as a carbuncle, and pomegranates and purple grapes and birds that dwell in marshy places. And she played to her mournful tunes and caused wailful violins to attend her and told her sad tales, thus holding her ever in an atmosphere of sweet sorrow. Then we have Photogen. Watho at length had her desire, for witches often get what they want. A splendid boy was born to the fair Aurora. Just as the sun rose, he opened his eyes. Watho carried him immediately to a distant part of the castle and persuaded the mother that he never cried but once, dying the moment he was born. Overcome with grief, Aurora left the castle as soon as she was able, and Watho never invited her again. And now the witch's care was that the child should not know darkness. Persistently she trained him until at last he never slept during the day and never woke during the night. She never let him see anything black, and even kept all dull colors out of his way. Never, if she could help it, would she let a shadow fall upon him, watching against shadows as if they had been live things that would hurt him. All day he basked in the full splendor of the sun, in some large rooms his mother had occupied. Watho used him to the sun until he could bear more of it than any dark-blooded. In the hottest of every day, she stripped him and laid him in it, that he might ripen like a peach, and the boy rejoiced in it, and he would resist being dressed again. She brought all her knowledge to bear on making his muscles strong and elastic and swiftly responsive, that his soul, she said laughingly, might sit in every fiber, be all in every part, and awake the moment of call. His hair was of the red gold, but his eyes grew darker as he grew, until they were as black as Vesper's. He was the merriest of creatures, always laughing, always loving, for a moment raging, then laughing afresh. Watho called him Photogen. Nycteris. 5 or 6 months after the birth of Photogen, the Dark Lady also gave birth to a baby. In the windowless tomb of a blind mother in the dead of night, under the feeble rays of a lamp in an alabaster globe, a girl came into the darkness with a wail. And just as she was born for the first time, Vesper was born for the second, and passed into a world as unknown to her as this was to her child, who would have to be born yet again before she could see her mother. Watho called her Nycteris, and she grew as like Vesper as possible in all but one particular. She had the same dark skin, dark eyelashes, and brown dark hair, and gentle sad look, but she had just the eyes of Aurora, the mother of Photogen, and if they grew darker as she grew older, it was only a darker blue. Watho, with the help of Falca, took the greatest possible care of her, in every way consistent with her plans, that is. The main point in which was that she should never see any light but what came from the lamp. Hence her optic nerves, and indeed her whole apparatus for seeing, grew both larger and more sensitive. Her eyes, indeed, stopped short only of being too large. Under her dark hair and forehead and eyebrows, they looked like two breaks in a cloudy night sky, through which peeped the heaven where the stars and no clouds lived. She was a sadly dainty little creature. No one in the world except those two was aware of the being of the little bat. Watho trained her to sleep during the day and wake during the night. She taught her music, in which she was herself a proficient, and taught her scarcely anything else. Okay, this next part is called How Photogen Grew. The hollow in which the castle of Watho lay was a cleft in a plain rather than a valley among hills, for at the top of its steep sides, both north and south, was a tableland, large and wide. It was covered with rich grass and flowers, with here and there a wood, the outlying colony of a great forest. These grassy plains were the forest hunting grounds in the world. Great herds of small but fierce cattle, with humps and shaggy manes, roved about them, also antelopes and gnus, and the tiny roe deer, while the woods were swarming with wild creatures. The tables of the castle were mainly supplied from them. The chief of Watho's huntsmen was a fine fellow, and when Photogen began to outgrow the training she could give him, she handed him over to Fargu. He, with a will set about teaching him all he knew. He got him pony after pony, larger and larger as he grew, every one less manageable than that which had preceded it, and advanced him from pony to horse, and from horse to horse, until he was equal to anything in that kind which the country produced. In similar fashion, he trained him to the use of bow and arrow, substituting every 3 months a stronger bow and longer arrows, and soon he became, even on horseback, a wonderful archer. He was but 14 when he killed his first bull, causing jubilation among the huntsmen, and indeed through all the castle, for there too he was the favorite. Every day, almost as soon as the sun was up, he went out hunting, and would in general be out nearly the whole of the day. But Watho had laid upon Fargu just one commandment, namely that Photogen should on no account, whatever the plea, be out until sundown, or so near as to wake in him the desire of seeing what was going to happen. And this commandment Fargu was anxiously careful not to break. For although he would not have trembled had a whole herd of bulls come down upon him, charging at full speed across the level, and not an arrow left in his quiver, he was more than afraid of his mistress. When she looked at him in a certain way, he felt, he said, as if his heart turned to ashes in his breast, and what ran in his veins was no longer blood, but milk and water. So that, ere long, as Photogen grew older, Fargu began to tremble, for he found it steadily growing harder to restrain him. So full of life was he, as Fargu said to his mistress, much to her content, that he was more like a live thunderbolt than a human being. He did not know what fear was, and that not because he did not know danger, but he had had a severe laceration from the razor-like tusk of a boar, whose spine, however, he had severed with one blow of his hunting knife before Fargu could reach him with defense. when he would spur his horse into the midst of a herd of bulls, carrying only his bow and his short sword, or shoot an arrow into a herd and go after it, as if to reclaim it for a runaway shaft, arriving in time to follow it with a spear thrust. Fargu thought with terror how it would be when he came to know the temptation of the huddle-spot leopards and the knife-clawed lynxes with which the forest was haunted. For the boy had been so steeped in the sun from childhood, so saturated with this influence, that he looked upon every danger from a sovereign height of courage. When, therefore, he was approaching his 16th year, Fargu ventured to beg Wathu that she would lay her commands upon the youth himself and release him from responsibility for him. One might as soon hold a tawny maned lion as Photogen, he said. Wathu called the youth, and in the presence of Fargu, laid her command upon him never to be out when the rim of the sun should touch the horizon. The little education she intended Nycteris to have, Watho gave her by word of mouth, not meaning she should have light enough to read by. To leave other reasons unmentioned, she never put a book in her hands. Nycteris, however, saw so much better than Watho imagined that the light she gave her was quite sufficient, and she managed to coax Falca now and then, brought to bring her a child's book. But her chief pleasure was in her instrument. Her very fingers loved it, and would wander about its keys like feeding sheep. She was not unhappy. She knew nothing of the world except the tomb in which she dwelt, and had some pleasure in everything she did. But she desired, nevertheless, something more or different. She did not know what it was, and the nearest she could come to expressing it to herself was that she wanted more room. Watho and Falca would go from her beyond the shine of the lamp and come again. Therefore, surely there must be more room somewhere. As often as she was left alone, she would fall to poring over the colored bas-reliefs on the walls, under allegorical similitudes, and as nothing can be made that does not belong to the general scheme, she could not fail at least to imagine a flicker of relationship between some of them, and thus a shadow of the reality of things found its way to her. There was one thing, however, which moved and taught her more than all the rest, the lamp, namely that hung from the ceiling, which she always saw light, though she never saw the flame, only the slight condensation towards the center of the alabaster globe. And besides the operation of the light itself after its kind, the indefiniteness of the globe, and the softness of the light, giving her the feeling as if her eyes could go in and out of its whiteness, were somehow also associated with the idea of space and room. She would sit for an hour together, gazing up at the lamp, and her heart would swell as she gazed. She would wonder what had hurt her when she found her face wet with tears, and then would wonder how she could have been hurt without knowing it. She never looked thus at the lamp except when she was alone. The lamp. Watho, having given orders, took it for granted that they were obeyed, and that Falca was all night long with Nycteris, whose day it was. But Falca could not get into the habit of sleeping through the day, and would often leave her alone half the night. Then it seemed to Nycteris that the white lamp was watching over her, as it was never permitted to go out while she was awake at least, about light. While she was awake at least, Nycteris, except by shutting her eyes, knew less about darkness than she did about light. Also, the lamp being fixed high overhead, and in the center of everything, she did not know much about shadows either. The few there were fell almost entirely on the floor, or kept like mice about the foot of the walls. Once, when she was thus alone, there came the noise of a far-off rumbling. She had never before heard of a sound in which she did not know the origin, and here, therefore, was a new sign of something beyond these chambers. Then came a trembling, then a shaking. The lamp dropped from the ceiling to the floor with a great crash, and she felt as if both her eyes were hard shut and both her hands over them. She concluded that it was the darkness that had made the rumbling and the shaking, and rushing into the room, had thrown down the lamp. She sat trembling. The noise and the shaking ceased, but the light did not return. The darkness had eaten it up. Her lamp gone, the desire at once awoke to get her out of the prison. She scarcely knew what out meant, out of one room into another, where there was not even a dividing door, only an open arch, was all that she knew of the world. But suddenly she remembered that she had heard Falca speak of the lamp going out. This must be what she had meant. And if the lamp had gone out, where had it gone? Surely where Falca went, and like her it would come again. But she could not wait. The desire to go out grew irresistible. She must follow her beautiful lamp. She must find it. She must see what it was about. Now there was a curtain covering a recess in the wall where some of her toys and gymnastic things were kept. And from behind that curtain Watho and Falco always appeared, and behind it they vanished. How they came out of solid wall, she had not an idea. All up to the wall was open space, and all beyond it seemed wall. But clearly, the first and only thing she would do was to feel her way behind the curtain. It was so dark that a cat could not have caught the largest of mice. Nectarus could see better than any cat, but now her great eyes were not of the smallest use to her. As she went, she trod upon a piece of the broken lamp. She had never worn shoes or stockings, and the fragment, though being of soft alabaster, it did not cut, yet hurt her foot. She did not know what it was, but as it had not been there before the darkness came, she suspected that it had to do with the lamp. She kneeled, therefore, and searched with her hands, and bringing two large pieces together, recognized the shape of the lamp. Therefore it flashed upon her that the lamp was dead, that this brokenness was the death of which she had read without understanding, that the darkness had killed the lamp. What then could Falca have meant when she spoke of the lamp going out? There was the lamp, dead indeed, and so changed that she would never have taken it for a lamp but for the shape. Oh, it was not the lamp any more now, it was dead, for all that made it a lamp was gone, namely the bright shining of it. Then it must be the shine, the light that had gone out. That must be what Falca meant, and it must be somewhere in the other place in the wall. She started afresh after it and groped her way to the curtain. Now she had never in her life tried to get out, and did not know how, but instinctively she began to move her hands about over one of the walls behind the curtain, half expecting them to go into it, as she supposed Watho and Falca did. But the wall repelled her with inexorable hardness, and she turned to the one opposite. In so doing, she set her foot upon an ivory die, and as it met sharply the same spot the broken alabaster had already hurt, she fell forward with her outstretched hands against the wall. Something gave way, and she tumbled out of the cavern. Out. But alas, out was very much like in, for the same enemy, the darkness, was here also. The next moment, however, came a great gladness. A firefly, which had wandered in from the garden. She saw the tiny spark in the distance. With the slow pulsing ebb and throb of light, It came pushing itself through the air, drawing nearer and nearer, with that motion which more resembles swimming than flying, and the light seemed the source of its own motion. My lamp, cried Nycteris. It is the shininess of my lamp which the cruel darkness drove out. My good lamp has been waiting for me here all the time. I knew I would come after it and waited to take me with it. She followed the firefly, which, like herself, was seeking the way out. If it did not know the way, it was yet light, and because all light is one, any light may serve to guide to more light. If she was mistaken in thinking it the spirit of her lamp, it was of the same spirit of her lamp, and had wings. The gold-green jet boat, driven by light, went throbbing before her through a long, narrow passage. Suddenly it rose higher, and the same moment Nycteris fell upon an ascending stair. She had never seen a stair before, and found going up a curious sensation. Just as she reached what seemed the top, the firefly ceased to shine, and so disappeared. She was in utter darkness once more. But when we are following the light, even its extinction is a guide. If the firefly had gone on shining, Nycteris would have seen the stair turn, and would have gone up to Wathos's bedroom, whereas now, feeling straight before her, she came to a latched door, which, after a good deal of trying, she managed to open, and stood in a maze of wondering perplexity, awe, and delight. What was it? Was it outside of her, or something taking place in her head? Before her was a very long and very narrow passage, broken up she could not tell how, and spreading out above and on all sides to an infinite height and breadth and distance, as if space itself were growing out of a trough. It was brighter than her rooms had ever been, brighter than if 6 alabaster lamps had been burning in them. There was a quantity of strange streaking and mottling about it, very different from the shapes on her walls. She was in a dream of pleasant perplexity, of delightful bewilderment. She could not tell whether she was upon her feet or drifting about like the firefly, driven by the pulses of an inward bliss. But she knew little as yet of her inheritance. Unconsciously she took one step forward from the threshold, and the girl who had been from her very birth a troglodyte stood in the ravishing glory of a southern night, lit by a perfect moon. Not the moon of our northern clime, but the moon like silver glowing in a furnace. A moon one could see to be a globe, not far off, a mere flat disk on the face of the blue, but hanging down halfway, and looking as if one could see all around it by a mere bending of the neck. "It is my lamp," she said, and stood dumb with parted lips. She looked and felt as if she had been standing there in silent ecstasy from the beginning. "No, it is not my lamp," she said after a while. "It is the mother of all the lamps." And with that she fell on her knees and spread out her hands to the moon. She could not in the least have told what was in her mind, but the action was in reality just a begging of the moon to be what she was. That precise, incredible splendor hung in the far-off roof, that very glory essential to the being of poor girls born and bred in caverns. It was a resurrection, nay, a birth itself to Nycteris. What the vast blue sky studded with tiny sparks like the heads of diamond nails could be. What the moon, looking so absolutely content with light, why she knew less about them than you and I. But the greatest of astronomers might envy the rapture of such a first impression at the age of 16. Immeasurably imperfect it was, but false the impression could not be, for she saw with the eyes made for seeing, and saw indeed with many men are 2 eyes to see. As she knelt, something softly flapped her, embraced her, stroked her. She rose to her feet but saw nothing, did not know what it was. It was likest a woman's breath, for she knew nothing of the air even, had never even breathed the still newborn freshness of the world. Her breath had come to her only through long passages and spirals in the rock. Still less did she know of the air alive with motion, of that thrice blessed thing, the wind of a summer night, joy. To breathe was a perfect existence. It seemed to her the light itself she drew into her lungs. Possessed by the power of the gorgeous night, she seemed at one and the same moment annihilated and glorified. She was in the open passage or gallery that ran round the top of the garden walls between the cleft battlements, but she did not once look down to see what lay beneath. Her soul was drawn to the vault above her with its lamp and its endless room. At last she burst into tears and her heart was relieved, as the night itself is relieved by the lightning and rain. And now she grew thoughtful. She must hoard this splendor. What a little ignorance her gaolers had made of her. Life was a mighty bliss, and they had scraped hers to the bare bone. They must not know what she knew. She must hide her knowledge, hide it even from her own eyes, keeping it close in her bosom, content to know that she had it, or even when she could not brood on its presence, feasting her eyes with its glory. She turned from the vision, therefore, with a sigh of utter bliss, and with soft, quiet footsteps and groping hands, stole back into the darkness of the rock. What was darkness or the laziness of time's feet to one which had seen what she had that night seen? She was lifted above all weariness, above all wrong. When Falca entered, she uttered a cry of terror. But Nycteris called to her not to be afraid and told her how there had come a rumbling and a shaking and the lamp had fallen. Then Falca went and told her mistress, and within an hour a new globe hung in the place of the old one. Nycteris thought it did not look so bright and clear as the former, but she made no lamentation over the change. She was far too rich to heed it. For now, prisoner as she knew herself, her heart was full of glory and gladness. At times she had to hold herself from jumping up and going dancing and singing about the room. When she slept, instead of dull dreams, she had splendid visions. There were times, it is true, when she became restless and impatient to look upon her riches. But when she would reason with herself, saying, "What does it matter if I sit here for ages with my poor pale lamp, when out there a lamp is burning at which 10,000 little lamps are glowing with wonder?" She never doubted she had looked upon the day and the sun, of which she had read, and always when she read of the day and the sun, she had the night and the moon in her mind. And when she read of the night and the moon, she thought only of the cave and the lamp that hung there. Okay, so I think we might stop here, just because this is a pretty lengthy story that I'm going to do in 2 parts. But thank you so much for joining me today for this little fairy tale read-along. And I hope that you have a very, very restful sleep. And I'll see you again very